Welcome back to The Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am, as always, Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy. I am a pure and open channel for the finest vibrations of divine love and light, made manifest here, in service to Gaia and those who travel with her. Though most folks know me as Bob the Wizard, some Gandalf Bob the Wise, many more as the Weirdo in the Kilt, and a lot more besides. My last little series of videoettes have been sharing my journey through my psychotic breakdown, and now my journey becomes the recovery from. Now, I mentioned in the last little video when I was drifting, downloading and clearing, thank you for listening, my elaborate escape plans. Now, during the course of my somewhat erratic journey, or fortnight, under the care of the mental health services, I had hatched a number of cunning plans. The first one was quite clearly using my head as a battering ram. That had failed and drawn the attention of the medicals. Clearly getting out as a dead body and then suddenly reviving was something that I was living far too often. That wasn't an option. So my remaining option was play ball, comply, be a good boy and get home. Some of my more elaborate escape plans had been to attract the attention of the one and only wandering repairman I saw, to try and loan some tools, but he was a distant worker and quite clearly wasn't going to listen to some maniac screaming through the window, "Give us a screwdriver, mate." I clearly wasn't getting out of any of the doors at all. I had tried pushing buttons, security, speaking to other people, getting them to ring buttons, and when every time I saw a gap, trying to escape. That hadn't worked. I'd been through some somewhat bizarre moments, certainly while I was in there. At the time that I left, I'd completely shaved my head apart from my back knot, true warrior style. And clearly, my experiences were having some effect on my form. My most entertaining escape plan was to pass out my clothes. The observant amongst you have waded your way through many Wandering Wizard videos will notice that almost invariably it's not the same shirt, folks. I do wash them, but this is pretty much my uniform. That I'm too lazy to think about what to wear. Oh, and I like purple. I've been handing out my clothes, various t-shirts, my company logos on it, in an attempt that if everybody was dressed the same, I would be able to escape unnoticed from the ward by dressing, no less, as Lawrence of Arabia. During the course of my delusions and reading Churchill's great work, I had been crawling around inside the laundry baskets, all my fresh issues each day of sheets that I'd asked for. So I felt I was in prison, I might as well be asking for fresh sheets. That and the fact that I was sweating profusely as whatever it was pouring out of me. I would often wake up soaked, so I'd ask for fresh sheets. And in the sheets there were little tiny labels. I was actually starting to read an idea of my delusional mind. Messages, coded messages, in the laundry labels, trying to make sense of an escape plan that was being delivered to me. Written on those little tiny washing labels with the various symbols. I was trying to line up lights in my room at night. That's where I'd got to. The shutters as they opened would make lights that reminded me some way of an X-ray machine. So if I stood at the right place, my back against my open wardrobe like a sentry box, and then laid myself on the bed, maybe that night, when the car hit me, I'd wake up somewhere else rather than back in the same room. Some of the processes that I was trying to escape from. I said it was an elaborate plan. Having looked in the sheets, remembered the fact that clearly once I escaped from Colditch you'd need a disguise. I built myself a very elaborate disguise by basically turning my sheets into some kind of Lawrence of Arabia like dress up, taking my sheet and wrapping it around my head like Lawrence of Arabia, while putting on all my clothes underneath so I'd have many changes of clothes to confuse the guards, and pretending to be an enormously fat person walking out the door. The fact that at 6'5" and now wearing all my clothes, wearing a set of bed sheets with what could only be described as a rather effective turban wound round my head, certainly drew more attention than it distracted. I said I offer these really, as I look back, they are quite amusing. Some of the roller coaster that I experienced over those 2 weeks inside. Now clearly those elaborate plans were part of the early journey. I'd settled more, I was listening to music at times. At times I'd get reactive and shouty, I understood that. It's sort of in my nature, it's how my PTSD manifests. I'm normally very good at keeping it locked down when there's a need to let it out. But under highly stressed situations it can bubble out. As I said, having eventually had issue with personal hygiene of some of my fellow patients and having contracted COVID, been locked in my room and having passed my board, I was finally allowed out. Now, having passed away most of my clothes, clearly I was missing quite a lot of my kit. I'd made several attempts to regain my kit, several of them had been construed hostile, quite rightly striding into somebody's room going, "Oi, give it back," and as they try to prevent you from invading their space, hanging onto your leg as you walk them up the corridor. Well, sounds very amusing, must have been a complete bloody nightmare for the staff. You have my apologies. Would I have done that? Is that something I do at work? Is it something I would do in life, just walk off with somebody hanging off my leg? Yes, of course I would. Can't change who I am. But as I said, it certainly gives you an image of quite probably how glad they were to get me back into my cabin where I could start to ground. My escape, I say my escape, my good lady, after my board, was allowed to come up and pick me up. I pretty much was hanging on the edge of my seat. I was waiting at any minute for the door to slam shut and get to the door and be told, "You're not going, we've changed our mind. Something's come up. You said something, you did something." There'd been a pattern of that. You're almost out, you're back in, you're almost out. I laid on my bed that morning and I was just feeling very anxious, and there's a reason for that. By now I was off of the medication which I was really struggling with, if I'm honest. My infection was still treated, but coming under control. Although I was highly agitated, I was aware far more of myself and some of the things that might have gone on, or had gone on. I was certainly anxious to get home. As I said, my nights were difficult. I'll share the dreams. They were driven by the fact that I had a UTI, a high temperature. I was held inside, sensibly, under electric lights, whereas here, halogens is all I have at night. It was a highly charged, highly emotive, highly energetic situation with all of the noise of life, with everybody going through their stuff, with staff having to deal with all of that on a daily basis. The fact that I've emerged capable of talking about it is, frankly, a miracle. It was my fear that I'd never get out of there. I'd be forever on the tablets, trapped, lost in my own breakdown, unable to break out because there was just nothing familiar. That was much as the good lady and I can row at the time. She was there for me that day. She came in her fury, bless her. I walked out the door, didn't even have shoes. Everybody sensibly telling me to wait. I was having none of it. Nobody was stopping me. I pretty much dropped possessions as I walked up the road. Took my tobacco pouch, walked round the corner, looked at the Dartford Bridge. I must have rolled myself about 15 cigarettes, one after the other, and chain smoked them while I cried. The relief. I wandered back in my socks to see the good lady, having accumulated all of my clothing from various lockers, scatterings, although some were clearly lost. Price we pay. I managed to get me back home. It was a nervous journey back home. I mean, clearly we're both masked now. I returned home, here, back to my family, and almost immediately isolated down to the cabin. That's probably a good thing. That's very much a good thing. space, a decompression space, to come back into alignment after an experience like that, and re-gel and reconnect back down as a father with my family, rather than the insane madman that they'd been living with or hearing about for a month. Oh, don't get me wrong, I'm still eccentric. That's never going to change, folks. But this, by my own admittance, was a level above and beyond. It served a purpose, which I'll share in Rude Awakenings. Now, having been desectioned, as I will continually say, deemed safe. Obviously I was deemed a COVID risk, so I was under COVID management here. Self-isolated, eating my food outside. To be honest, in my own space again, as chaotic as it was after the events of the family crisis. I focused myself back into a reality that made sense again. My own home, with my family around me. I was erratic, clearly. It takes time to wind down from that level of terror, that level of fear, that kind of an experience. But it happened relatively quickly. And now I'll share one of the major reasons why. As soon as I got home, back here, my very first action was to keep up with my antibiotics, which I fully understand, but to pretty much come off of any prescription that had been given to me. I needed to get back and use the methods that I'd been using to manage my PTSD. Clearly, in a crisis like that, very few things you can do other than follow the advice I give my children. You can't go over the experience, you can't go under the experience, you can't work your way around it or blame anybody else for it. You just have to live through it, take it on the chin and go, yes, that was me. That was me in my most extreme shadow reflection of the man that I consider myself to be, the human I consider myself to be, for the majority of the time. To see the bit of me that had frightened me since I was a child. The very first time that I epically lost my temper as a teenager and lifted and thrown a human being, I don't know, practically double my body weight. Alright, he had trodden on my ingrown toenail. I was in an immense amount of pain. It was my first experience that a body in pain will override what you think it's capable of and can achieve all manner of things. Positive and negative. It's always frightened me, the fact that even under the duresses that I just experienced, under those kind of pressures, for the most part, apart from roaring on occasions and self-damage as I've head-butted things, everybody around me was pretty much alive, unbruised, frightened. And that for me, having faced my greatest fear, which was what I was given to face in January 2022. Not in this life. This life I've been a peaceful person for the most part unless I'm really pushed. But long back in my history, a long carried guilt. Now I probably mentioned at some point in my journey, my one issue in this life has been that I've always felt guilty. Even when I've stood my ground, if I've let something out, even though it might have been justified. Guilty of how that's been seen by others. I'm sorry. What can I do to put it right? It's been my life, I suppose, the life of the master, of achieving balance, of wanting to clear my karmic debt, for want of a better word, to actually finally acknowledge that I can see both sides. I'm not going to sit in judgment, either of myself or another. It's been a costly journey, folks. It's been a worthy journey. Now, having got back here and decided that clearly the only way that I was going to gain an understanding back of my reality again was to revert back to the things that worked. I flushed the tablets, kept up with the antibiotics, as I was previously rambling, and I quite literally necked half a bottle of cannabis oil. It's the first night's sleep that I'd had in 14 days, unbroken. I slept and slept and slept. The deep sleep of the exhausted. When I woke up in the morning and looked myself in the mirror, I was a shadow of myself, physically. Over the course of that psychotic break, the UTI raging through my body, being in flight and flight for that length of time and having to control it, I had burnt off 10 kilos on an already relatively lean form. That was the physical energy that was burned as my mind and body raced through that situation. Your head burns calories, folks. Your mind burns calories, folks. Not always an easy way. As I said, I literally arrived home, not even fitting in my clothes. A shadow of myself, nervous, frightened, isolated, even within my own space. A few days of decent home cooking, cooked with love. Just the occasional interaction with my family, even though they were masked and sitting on a bench at a distance from me, was healing to me in ways that most of you can imagine. My interaction with the crisis team who were tasked to see me twice a day, just to make sure that I was readjusting to life, frightening too many people. Must have had quite an interesting experience as I started to ground in what is my reality. By that I mean this one that feels very 3D world. I live in a space where I have an open fire, axis, relive my pagan childhood, my other lives, whatever way you look at it. This is how I anchor in my reality. I understand that that's quite different. The fact that my crisis interviews were often conducted outdoors around a fire has brought me a great sense of achievement. I've lived in their world. Now it's a chance for them to live in mine. I was erratic at the time. They were obviously monitoring the increase in the amount of cannabis, which had been very much deemed to be a factor of my fall from grace. And what I would have said was a panicked grasp at something to stop the pain clearly meant that when I arrived in hospital I had massive amounts of THC in my system. In fact, throughout the duration of my time that I was there, and I was regularly tested, it was still present. The fact that as that THC, or those cannabinoids, depleted in me, my dreams became increasingly bizarre while I was in hospital. Intense. Enlightening. I don't know. Certainly in the end. There's a reason why I try and process most of my life here, in meditation, not in a dream state. Sometimes those dreams in the past have been very unpleasant to me, particularly as a child. Deep-seated old fears, old guilts. Talk about those in rude awakenings. The why, what I went through. Needless to say, as we're talking about the start of my recovery, the fact that I was sleeping and when these things come up, able to think through my experiences. Of course, during the course of that recovery, I was reactive on occasions. I believe on one occasion I was invited, would I like to volunteer to go back in and see how I'd get back on within the unit. I think my answer may have contained a few offs. I certainly pointed out that if I was to be taken from this space, they may require an armed response unit, because there was no way, having fought my way through that hell, that I was leaving my family again. That may have been misconstrued on the day, but without doubt, the fact that on explanation to the crisis team the next day, and an understanding of exactly what I needed, an understanding mental health worker who went, I understand that what you do is bizarre. I don't understand it. But I can see that it's starting to work for you. That was my switching point. I probably stopped fighting against that I've got to conform or whatever it was that was going on in my head. I was now home and that I was starting to make a recovery. Now clearly, part of the way I mentioned that I dealt with things while I was inside, as I now call it, is by cleaning. The fact that the clean one in the family, the tidy, structured one in the family, was missing. And no judgment, clearly they'd lost Dad for a bit. The house was chaos. And strangely, in clearing that chaos, it did help me to start working through the physical remains of whatever the chaos that I'd just lived through, why it had happened. As traumatic as it sounds at times, it was a massively cathartic process to quite literally meet your dragon, explode your dragon, whatever you want to call it, that inner something or other, shatter throughout space and time, and then regain a root, re-find myself, and come back to a functioning father within my family. It wasn't bad within a month. Four weeks later, with a clean bill of health, having been discharged fully from the mental health service, I did what I always do, put myself back into the test. I went back to work and had a very successful day playing the angry man, capable of once again tapping into those experiences and that understanding, but not anything more than play, not overloaded by it anymore, not feeling it overtaking me, but just an energy. Now, is that down to the cannabis? No. Is it down to the cannabis in combination with mindfulness and an understanding family that have given me space? Because the months that followed were certainly dippy and trophy at times. But as I sit here now 6 months later, it was certainly a worthy journey. It's certainly an experience. I can certainly say over the last decade, as I'll go on to explain in future episodes, I've certainly seen myself in lightest light and darkest dark. Certainly I gained an understanding as to why is all this happening to me. It most certainly wasn't punishment. It wasn't some kind of vengeful act, some kind of punishment for previous sins. Quite the opposite. It was a space for me to examine where those roots are, where those root guilts were, and each and every one of them was in leaving my family, losing my family, exploding, destroying our families. All of those guilts, the old warrior guilts that I'd carried long down my line, had all come home to roost, exploded in my face and in others, and put me in a place where I had no choice but to look at them, where I couldn't escape from them, couldn't distract myself from them, where I'd just have to keep reliving them until I'd accepted them. Unless anybody thinks there's any dark skeletons in this life, seriously, I've been the fluffiest bunny. I have been the fluffiest bunny. And many of those dark experiences were way back down my line. But it very much was a path of, literally, most of my path is that of the healer. And in order to be an effective healer, we have to have had the experiences. So, probably one reason why I chose the path I chose. Sirens again, folks. It's always a musical theme tune to the way that the henge works. Now, that's been my great sharing. So, apart from some of the personal stuff of what it is to travel within the mind, no matter what the triggers for that journeying are. Probably do a little video next of what's emerged, what has actually awakened, who is Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy, in short and simple terms. Thank you for listening. It's been an epic untelling. I feel much better, lighter in myself for having shared my journey, light and dark, particularly focused on the last 10 years. put me in a place of choice. The fact that I choose to continue to be here, living my life, loving those around me, is hopefully a sign that no matter how hard it can feel at times, no matter how harsh, how alone we can feel, in time all things pass, even that. Take care, go well, and blessed be.